Hello, class. I'm your professor, Frank Henry Law, and this is What is Racism? This is part of the Barriers to Health Equity lecture. So what is racism? So before we talk about what is racism, let's talk about this concept of race. What exactly is race, right? So race is a social interpretation of certain physical characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, and how people are perceived and valued based on their physical traits. So looking at someone with darker skin or whatever it may be, we automatically ascribe them to a race, right? And we have to understand that race wasn't even really a concept, right? Until the scientist decided to do a race-based classification. And he came up with 5 different categories. And of course, he put Caucasian and white as like the number one, and black as the lowest. So, and then American too. So this started off with who's on top and who's on bottom, right? So other than based on someone looks, that's how this classification was done. So there was no, this is a better race because they're doing X, Y, and Z. It's just they're better, they're worse. Let's all agree. Cool, we agree. We're all good with this. Great, let's move forward. Like that's what it was. So here in the US, we collect the census, right? And the first census was done in 1790, and it only had 3 racial groups: whites, blacks as 3/5 of a person, and only civilized Indians, right? Those who paid taxes was considered someone who was civilized. So blacks were 3/5 of a person, so they weren't even considered a whole person, right? And that's a weird concept to me because, a person to person, but when the US Census and so forth, when we were first talking about race, one person was only 3/5. So then we get these new racial categories were added in the 19th century and beyond. And you see Chinese in 1870 were added, Japanese in the 1890s, and then Mexicans in the 1930s. Now, what's interesting is that Mexicans at one point were actually considered white. So in 1929, Mexicans were actually categorized as white. Why? Their skin color. And then in 1930, they were considered non-white. And then in 1940, 42, they were switched back to white. So now we understand that race is something that's created. There's no basis to it. It's just a way for society to categorize people. And really at the end of the day, it really depends on what your appearance is. I mean, you'll hear a lot of stories about how Black people in the past, depending on if they were white passing, if they were light enough, that they assumed roles in society as white, and they called themselves white. But yet when if your skin color is dark, wherever it may be, then you're not white passing, and so you're putting into the black category. Same thing when it came to Mexicans and so forth. They were considered white. There is a video that I posted about the brick people, and it talks about like the integration into society, and it talks about white how how Spain was so little, but yet they were able to grow so big, because what they did was, if you're a light-skinned Mexican, you were able to get Spaniard citizenship. So that's how Spain grew their community when California was being transformed, was taken over from Mexico. And people are beginning to establish. Spain came in and said, okay, if you're light, then you can apply for Spaniard or Spaniard citizenship, and that's what they did. So that's how Spain their their population. But yeah, so now let's look at racism. So racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning values based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which we already talked about, we call it race, that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages others, individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through a waste of human resources. So racism structures opportunities and assigns value based on how someone looks, right? That's it, just how someone looks. That's what you're deciding, whether or not that person gets resources or not, whether, how we want to treat that person. It's all based on their race and their race alone. So what results is conditions that unfairly advantage some and unfairly disadvantage others. So when we think about redlining, of how if you were living in a certain neighborhood or if you were not, if you were white, then you can get a mortgage. If you didn't look a certain way, if you lived in a certain neighborhood, then you cannot get a mortgage. That's racism. Racism could be intentional, unintentional. Remember, we had those explicit biases and implicit biases. Explicit biases mean like, you know, for a fact, you're conscious of that you hold this belief. And implicit is that you had no idea that this would be offensive, whatever it may be. But like I said, once you're educated on it, you are no longer implicit, you're now explicitly biased. Racism is structured, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Okay, so we're going to break down the different types of racism. And so we have internalized racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, and also structural racism. So when it comes to internalized racism, this occurs when victims of racism internalize prejudicial attitudes towards themselves. So you begin to believe what people are saying about you, right? And oftentimes you have this internalized racism where you believe like, oh, Black people are lazy. So you believe, oh yeah, Black people are lazy. And then now every time you even look at your own culture and people, you're like, oh yeah, all Black, you start going along with the narrative, all Black people are lazy, or all Mexicans are, like, you go along with that narrative, right? So you have been conditioned to believe that this is someone who looks like you, this is how they are, right? And so you begin to look at other people who look like you, and that's how you kind of talk about yourselves. Once again, internalized racism, it goes down to different forms. We have this internalized oppression. So you feel like you're racially inferior, right? You're the inferior race. You have negative beliefs about oneself, and also you accept those, right? And then you have internalized privilege, where it's belief of superiority, entitlement. Usually those who are racist, you know, have these ideas and these views, or you believe from your internalized oppression that you believe that another race is superior to your race, right? So this is internalized privilege and internalized oppression. We also have interpersonal racism. So this is personally mediated. So these are biases that occur when individuals interact with others and their personal racial beliefs affect their public interactions, right? So you prejudge someone. Someone tells you like, oh, watch out for them over there. You know, all these people are like this. And then you start assuming that, and you start taking on that role of, yeah, all those people are like this, okay? But this comes from interaction with others. Institutional racism, this is like systemic racism, right? Or systemic barriers, where it's in the policies, it's ingrained in the practices and things of that nature. Structural racism. Now, structural racism, once again, this is overt racism or obvious. It also be unintentional discrimination that, once again, are reflected in the politics and practices, are passed on through generation. Like, these are things that are like pretty much embedded in our society. There's a difference between structural and versus systemic, even though they're always clumped together, but I just want you to be aware of what the difference is. So when it comes to systemic racism and structural racism, they're often interchangeable, but they do emphasize different things. So systemic racism emphasizes the involvement of the whole system, right? Often all systems, for example, political, legal, economic, healthcare. So it's the whole entire system. Structural racism is the structure. So it's the laws, the policies, the things that really shape us, right? The things that shape the whole entire system. So oftentimes systemic racism includes structural racism. So when we say systemic racism, you're also talking about structural racism. And that's it for this. I mean, that's just a brief breakdown of what racism is. So as we go through examples and things like that, and we begin to pull out health disparities, I want y'all to recognize that there's different levels to racism and there's different impacts as well. But that concludes the lecture. Have a good rest of the day.